Well, I'm going to get us started because I want to make sure there's enough time for the kind of robust discussion that I know this topic will engender. I thank you for coming again today, everyone, and keeping this conversation in language studies going at University of Texas and our Texas Language Center. I'm Tom Garza, from both the director of the Texas Language Center and from the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies. I'm so happy to welcome you here because this is now the second installment of what we hope will be at least one more full semester of talks focusing on translation studies, and their impact on world languages here, not just at the University of Texas, but globally. A couple of just quick housekeeping announcements to begin with. The fact that you're all here means you know where to find us, but just in case, please do check the TLC website periodically. There's a couple of flyers there with our upcoming whatever events we've got through the remainder of the term and on into the summer. But in the fall, we begin with a whole new slate of events, workshops, and so forth. Graduate students, adjunct faculty at all levels are welcome and very much want to be a part of this. So please do spread the word and keep everyone coming. I want to get to the matter at hand because as we began our translation series last month with a wonderful presentation by one of our colleagues from the Department of Program in Comparative Literature, probably should be a department, but that's another story, of a program in Comparative Literature, and I think was a perfect way to kick off this topic because it really was at the intersection of, which our topic is today, but the intersection of the theoretical side of translation studies and what kind of applications it has in real world, real world applications. And in her case, beginning an entire series of translation of Turkish literature to make the world more aware of that wonderful body of literature. The subject today, we wanted to bring together some of our esteemed scholar colleagues from the program in Comparative Literature to bring to the table a discussion that I think has been going on certainly under the current for quite a while now, and only since translation studies has now come really into being a doctoral level disciplinary study, become now kind of out for all of us to look at it as well. And so I'm going to introduce the moderator of the panel today, also from the program in Comparative Literature, and then Andrea, you'll take over introducing our wonderful colleagues as we enter into this topic of translation studies and the intersection of world languages and literatures. It is a remarkable pleasure to get to introduce this person and to say these words in this order. Dr. Andrea Maillard is no longer a PhD candidate in the program of Comparative Literature, but instead, yes, a recent PhD in Comparative Literature who successfully defended her dissertation, Journeying Beyond Binaries, Gender and Fluidity in 19th Century French Travel Writing. And I say, having been on that committee, just a very, very fine piece of scholarship. And I know it will find both a publication venue and a very, very large reading public as soon as it is published last month. While Andrea's recent research has journeyed away from translation studies proper, previous projects have included a comparative study of the English translations of Alessandro Mazzone's I Promessi Sposi, as well as undergraduate creative thesis titled I Seek a Dark and Quiet Stanza, translations of scapigliatura poetry. Andrea holds dual undergraduate certificates in translation and creative writing from Princeton and looks forward to returning to translation practice in earnest post-graduation. She is going to be our moderator for the panel today. And so, Andrea, I'll pass it on to you to introduce our esteemed colleagues.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to have so many wonderful colleagues in comparative literature here today to participate in this panel. So we're going to go ahead and begin the event by having some brief presentations by each of our speakers, and then we'll move towards sort of more of a conversation in the latter half of the talk. So I'm gonna introduce y'all in order as you each come up, in the order alphabetically that we had you on the flyer. So we'll have Oscar begin. So Oscar Chaidez is a native of Mexico. Oscar is currently pursuing a PhD in comparative literature at the University of Texas at Austin. Oscar specializes in queer Latin American literatures and cultures. Specifically, he is interested in the relationship between religion and sexuality in this region of the world, and the way writers and artists have negotiated Catholicism in their work. recurrently transforming its language to make space for their differing desires. So Oscar, we'll hand it over to you, and I'm going to also be our tech director here and point our camera towards you. Okay.
Ready. First, I'd like to thank Dr. Garza, the Text Language Center, and Andrea for giving us this space, and in particular me. So what brought me to translation? I've always been interested. As many of you know, I arrived here as a teenager from school, not speaking English. Yes, no, and please were like 3 words I currently say. So translation has always been, in a sense, part of my life. But obviously from a very early age, I was also very attracted to literature. So those two kind of go together. That's where my interest began essentially, but more specifically to translation as a discipline. My introduction was through the writing workshop that here Anna Vilner organized began organizing a couple of years ago, where she invited me. She knew I was interested in translating this book or poetry collection called Poesía by Abigail Bojorquez, and I wanted a space to work on it, and so Anna Vilner kind of facilitated that. As Andrea pointed, I studied queer Latin American literatures and cultures, and one of the things that I realized studying it is that a lot of queer Latin American literature remains largely untranslated for a number of reasons. Amongst them, Latin America is very conservative and religious society, which is one of the things I kind of study with in my graduate studies, broadly speaking, and so I realized that what gets translated is not a democratic process by a number of forces, and so for comparative literature, for the master's report, we are actually allowed to do like a normal essay or report, or actually a translation, and so I thought that was much more exciting, and I also wanted it as an opportunity to translate Abigail Bojorquez's. And so I kind of decided to do that for my master's report. Poesía is to give you like a bit of a introduction to it. Is basically the only 20th century poetry collection to like avowedly kind of portray the AIDS/HIV experience as it was experienced by the queer community in Mexico, and it hasn't been translated, and as a matter of fact, it's almost in danger of being erased, because I remember having a conversation with Mr. Richmond about how can I get my hands on a copy of Poesía. Not even the Benson had it, and I thought it was actually an important text, and so I wanted to get my hands on it so that I could translate it for my master's report. And eventually, obviously, through my advisor, we were able to get a PDF, and so I could begin the project. And so obviously I couldn't finish it on time, and again I decided to do like a normal report, but keep working on it. Translation is so much work. I was such a newbie. I didn't know how much work how hard it was, and how much of your time. So, but it was a nice introduction. And so obviously I think that as competent, we kind of have this realizations of what gets translated, what gets not, and as specialists, we should be having this conversation as to, and for me, I see translation as a way to make sure that this text survives. So that's essentially how I got into translation, and kind of where I'm at in terms of this discipline. So I'd like to thank Vilner for allowing me to be part of the translation workshop, and obviously a lot of people have facilitated this project for me, and that's essentially it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Oscar. So next we'll move on to our second speaker. We have Anna Duclaud. Anna is a 4th-year PhD student in the Comparative Literature program, originally from Mexico City. She received a bachelor's degree in comparative literature from Queen Mary University, London, and a master's in European and Latin American literature from the University of Cambridge. She is interested in the comparative study of avant-garde movements in France and Latin America. Specifically, she looks at the transmission as well as transformation of ideas through the act of translation in literary magazines during the early to mid-20th century. She mostly works with French and Spanish. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. I also would like to thank Dr. Tom Garza and Andrea and the Texas Language Center for giving us this wonderful opportunity to get together and talk about translation. I am in full comps mode right now, so like my talk will be a bit more like of the theories that I've been looking at. So like right now, you know, from a theoretical perspective, my interest in translation stems in seeing translation as a creative act. A figure who very much informs my interest in translation is scholar Haroldo de Campos, who in this wonderful essay called Translation as Creation and Criticism, paradoxically states that to translate a creative text, one must accept the impossibility of doing so. And this premise, De Campos argues, allows us to see translation as a transcreation of the original. This is his term, in which the translator actively takes apart the source text in order to recreate it in the context of a target language. This process of transcreation, however, often requires the translator to sacrifice what the text says in order to reproduce what the text does. Susan Bernofsky, in her own treatise of translation as an act of revision, also speaks of this sacrifice, paradoxically stating that freedom from the source text must be taken to reach faithfulness. But how does this freedom look? What is gained and what is lost in the act of translation? And finally, a question that I often ask myself is, what are the ethical implications of straying away from the original text? These are questions that currently guide my research and interest in the field of translation. And for instance, I recently presented a paper at ACLA on Cuban author Cintia Vitiev's translation of Arthur Rimbaud's collection Illuminations into Spanish. And I looked at the different ways in which Vitiev rewrote Rimbaud away from other avant-garde interpretations through the act of translation to have the French poet align with his own poetics and aesthetic preoccupations. So I'm really interested in this idea of seeing translation as an act of interpretation and as a creation of a new text. But to be able to create a new text through the act of translation, a profound knowledge of both the source and the target language is necessary. A guiding principle, both in my research as well as in my own translation practice, stems from Gayatri Spivak, who in her essay, The Politics of Translation, describes translation as the most intimate act of reading. And when seen in this way, I agree and align with Spivak in that before embarking on a translation project, the translator must ensure that they are deeply familiar, not only with the source language and what is being said, but also with the cultural, political, and social context in which a text originates. Here is where I believe the ethical implications of translation come to the fore, as well as the importance of language learning. And while I do see translation as a creative act, and while I do believe that when seen as an interpretation, a text in translation acquires new meanings, functions, and values in the receiving language, I also believe that the translator is responsible for conveying the cultural and often political nuances found in the source text. And in this sense, I believe that studying as well as producing text in translation is essential to the field of world literature, since the zone of translation in this regard functions as a liminal porous border between different languages and cultures.
Thank you so much. So we'll move to our final speaker, and then we'll kind of open up the conversation to everyone. So Anna Vilner holds an MFA in literary translation from the University of Arkansas and is a PhD student in comparative literature here at UT Austin. Her interests range from 20th century Latin American literature, translation theory and history, exile narratives, to the relationship between archive and memory. Her selections and translations of Ebe Uar's Chronicas, titled A Question of Belonging, will be coming out with Archipelago Books next month. Congratulations. All right, Anna, take us away.
Thank you, Andrea and Dr. Garza and Paula for organizing this. It's a treat to be able to talk to two of my closest friends in the program about translation, which is one of my favorite topics. So as Andrea mentioned, I'm a practicing literary translator for about the past 10 years. I would say 10 years ago I started. And for that reason, I view translation both from the standpoint of craft as an inherently creative practice, and also from a more, in a more academic light, so theoretically, historically, etc. Some things I've been thinking a lot about recently are how people write about translation, how it kind of shows up culturally, and then also the processes that come before actually, selecting a text, framing a text after it's published, all of those things surrounding the actual work. So I've sort of zoomed out of just like doing translation analysis and have started considering those various processes. So I'm currently writing my dissertation prospectus, which hopefully I'll defend at the end of the month. And the prospectus has to do with translations of Russian language literature in Argentina. So Russian to Spanish translation in the 20th century. And there's a sort of gap in this history that I'm trying to fill. Right now, I'm in a lot of this preliminary work of just seeing what was translated, who it was translated by, key figures, where these translations are appearing. Sometimes it's sort of in underground ways. So during the various like anti-Marxist governments that Argentina saw in its 20th century. So to develop a translation history, then it will be necessary not only to contextualize analyses of translations, but also to take into account paratexts, such as introductions, afterwards, reviews and essays in periodicals and literary prizes. So again, on this process of selection, what gets selected to be translated and why, who does this? There's so many gatekeepers when it comes to this process. And I thought about selection in my own work and thinking about how it's not just this an easy process. Obviously, it's very deliberate as a translator. What do you want to bring into English and why right now? So some of the authors I've looked towards challenge maybe conventions in the source language and culture, but certainly challenge our own understandings of contemporary world literature. I wanted to share a quote by André Lefebvre. So he's been formerly a professor at UT, which I wish I could have worked with him. And I've used this, once it pops up, I'll read it.
Come on. Did you hit
Oh,
some
the
screen?
laptop fell asleep.
Ah,
Oh, yes, that's important.
sorry.
Actually, while that's happening, I'll put this so we have the.
Okay, so here's the quote I wanted to share, which I was sort of relying on to begin my own dissertation prospectus. Two factors basically determine the image of a work of literature as projected by a translation. These two factors are, in order of importance, the translator's ideology, so which is tied to patronage, so things like publishing houses, etc. And the poetics dominant in the receiving literature at the time the translation is made. So of course here, really stressing the importance of context. And this comes from Lefebvre's book, Translation, Rewriting, and the Manipulation of Literary Fame, originally published in '92. So I noticed a lot of problems with how, even when I first began translating, before I knew much about translation, the way that I would write about translation in reviews, for example. I used to do these capsule reviews for a literary journal that I was an editor for. And if translation is mentioned at all in reviews, it's usually glossed over. So instead of criticizing other people's kind of reviews and criticism, I decided to show you some of the reviews that I wrote a few, 7 or so years ago. So this is the first one. It's from Lena Wolf's The Polyglot Lovers. And it's a longer review, but I'm just underlining in both of the ones that I'll show you the small sentence that I sort of dedicate to the translation. So here, Wolf's tonal shifts between sections are handled deftly by Saskia Vogel, the translator responsible for bringing this novel into English. And then the next one. This is from After the Winter by Guadalupe Nedel. This is the one sentence that I dedicate to the translation here. Her character's mental states are described with precise language mirrored in Rosalind Harvey's translation. So it's really difficult for me to read my own writing on translation because now all of my thoughts have shifted, right? So I wouldn't, for example, say something like mirrored because it implies like a sort of equivalence that simply doesn't exist. The good thing about these two capsule reviews is that I do at least mention the translation, which doesn't seem like a lot, but considering that translators are so often unnamed, this seems like a step in the right direction. The not so productive thing, which I would be averse to doing now, is the sort of glossing over without considering the difficulties or particularities of bringing these particular novels, two very particular novels, into English and the interpretive lenses of their translators. So I'm not really taking into consideration the greater project that either of these translators had or their own very specific interpretation. But instead, I'm kind of just using this general language that I see kind of reflected everywhere, in major reviews in the New York Times, wherever you look. It's, yeah, very, very minimal. So I guess I'm looking forward to expanding our conversations on translation, how we talk about these texts. That's it, sorry, might have been long.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm gonna point this back and sorry, I'll come over here for our Q&A. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. I have a couple of questions that I would like to pose to the speakers to get us going, and then I would be happy to open it up to our wonderful audience that we have here today. Thank you all for coming out. So I'm just gonna come pull up a chair over here with y'all. So thank you all for your talks. I love the range of different topics y'all brought up between ethics, practice, theory. I feel like we've really got a really nice cross section of translation studies and how much there is involved with the field. So I appreciate each of you bringing your own sort of a viewpoint to each of your presentations here, and I hope we can continue to tease out some of these things in our questions. So the first thing I'd like to ask, for some of y'all have already started to answer in your talks, is just personally, how did you first encounter or engage with translation, whether to practice or as a field of theory or study, and then what drew you to it in particular, and what value you continue to find?
Should I? Go back to the order. Yeah, I kind of touched upon this through the writing workshop or through my decision to translate this poetry collection in a serious manner, but obviously, like I also mentioned in my little talk there, it's been something I've been always involved with. Obviously, as an immigrant, it's something you're involved with your whole life, essentially, especially if you begin acquiring a language in a less natural way or not as a child. I do remember, though, I've always been interested in translation, and there's a reason why I decided to take on this project, because I do remember as a teenager being interested in both in translation, but also acquiring the language. I do remember like going back and like just choosing a random book in Spanish. Remember one, the Arráncame la vida by Ángeles Mastreta. I remember like, okay, I'm gonna give myself the challenge of like translating my own and then go back and look at the actual translation. So from a very early period, I realized how different it was, how challenging it was, and how translation is not like a 1-to-1 ratio thing. It's like always about so much more than that. And I think that interest, I've always been so conscious of that. And I think that that's part of why I decided to eventually kind of, or take on the opportunity, I jumped on the opportunity to actually, begin doing translation myself. And so it's always, I've always been rather involved with, and I've always been interested in. Obviously, in regards to the value we place in it, it's for me, it's important to know what gets translated and what needs to be translated, and why doesn't, the questions that interest me is why hasn't it been translated? So that's kind of the value I place in it, or that's how I place the value. What do you?
I also, I mean, like my interest in translation also started with the translation group that we'll talk about later. Actually, I didn't actually present my own translations, but I attended some of the meetings, and that's where my interest really started. And then I took a graduate seminar with Dr. Emily Drumsta on literary translation. And that's where, and also, one of my favorite poets, his name is Gilberto Owen. He's an early 20th century Mexican poet. And early, I mean, like when I started looking at his work, I realized it had never been translated into English. So it's like a similar situation where it's like, he's like basically like to me, like one of the best poets that Mexican literature has to offer, and he's never been translated into English. So in this graduate seminar with Emily Drumsta, I began translating, and I'm almost finished with like one of his biggest poetry collections, which is a very exciting project, and I still don't know what I'm gonna do with it, but it's it's there. And yeah, I mean, I like it first began with this translation group, then I started, you know, in the grad seminar reading a lot about translation theories. And then I also became very interested in looking at translation also from a theoretical perspective, and analyzing translations is something that I find really interesting, and looking at, you know, like similarities and differences between source text and the translation, and what can be learned about, about like the specific context in which a text is received by looking at the translation is something that really fascinates me.
I did not realize that y'all had, that this was how. Congratulations to you.
It was pretty short-lived, we need to
Yes.
reinvigorate that.
This is not how we're coming to
Yeah.
the speakers. That's wonderful.
Yeah, so my experiences are pretty similar, I would say, to Oscar and Anna, similarly, but yeah, to both of you, actually. I grew up in an environment, so speaking Russian in the house and in the kind of the outside world, with my friends and everything. I was moving between languages because that was English and Russian, and then later in my 20s, I moved to Chile for a little bit, but without knowing Spanish. So one of the ways that I taught myself the language was actually I picked up translation along that time, or during that time. And so I know just from, even though I haven't incorporated this into the classroom yet, I know that for language learning, it's certainly very, very vital and good, you know, good practice. And then as a reader and a writer, of course, you can improve all of those things. Like there's no better way to get close to a text than by translating it, and to really think about things on a line level, and also how it exists in the author's work. So yeah, I guess for me, I would like to expand on the pedagogy of it, because now that I have a kind of an equal interest, I would say, in craft and the workshop component. So treating translation as a creative practice. And since before UT, I did study it in a creative writing program, actually. So it was taught very differently than I see translation being taught at the academic level. But I haven't yet been in a classroom where I feel like both of those things are given equal weight. So that would be a dream course of mine, to teach like a creative type of workshop, which has a heavy like theoretical side to it, and we're constantly reading and building up our vocabulary and how to talk about translations. Because during my MFA, I feel as though I improved greatly as a translator, and I was able to see the translation as its own standalone original text that didn't rely so much on the source or the original. But we had really no language to talk about what was going on. So often, you know, we would say things like, this doesn't quite sound right, or the humor isn't really getting across. Let's consult the original. And someone say, could you give me like a literal translation of what that is? But I think that, yeah, it's sort of that program. I mean, translation studies is like booming right now. I think it's only going to continue doing so. So I think incorporating it in this interdisciplinary way, it's in my opinion, the way to approach it.
So you're leading into my next study.
Yes.
No, thank you for the very natural transition. So the next question that I had for the full panel, and you may have additional thoughts on this as well, but have you used translation in your teaching at all thus far as graduate students, whether as a language instructor or rhetoric instructor or another type of class? And if so, how have you brought translation or translation studies into the classroom? And what response did you get from your students? And if you have not had a chance to do that, how do you imagine possibly doing that and engaging in translation in the future courses that you do have the opportunity to assign and teach?
All right. The order. I am a language instructor in the Spanish and Portuguese department. And so yes, I love working with translation all the time. I think it's such a neat way to kind of give students language awareness. In the sense when something is easily translated and when it's not, so they can realize, oh, there are two different languages, which is something I constantly tell my students, is that they want to translate things like by the order, and that's something I keep reiterating to them. It doesn't work like that. It's a whole different language. But one of the things I love doing is teaching them through music. So I put them, if we're learning whatever the lesson in the song kind of encaptures that. I mean, there's a lot of people do this. Pedro was laughing because I'll explain right.
And if I'm sorry for the interruption, what level would this be that you're teaching?
Oh, this is 601. This
So
is
really base level.
base level,
yeah,
yes,
okay.
introduction. Most students have had some kind of exposure to Spanish because they're from Texas, but or in high school, but yes, it's introductory level. But I do love putting music videos and then I pull up the lyrics and have it translated. So that way they're not only learning the language itself, but also it's like culture. But I think that I was laughing because he's a big music person, and now every time he's like, oh, I played that song to my students, and now it's something I can't shut up about because oh, I'm gonna show that song to my students, and it's something that's always circling. So yes, I do love working with translation. I feel like it's such a neat way, and it seems to me that students really enjoy it. So yes.
I'm gonna interject a small story of my own, because I've also done that with students before. And I found, I took a Disney song and I found the, like a French version of how they had translated it for the French edition of the movie. And so it was a song many of them were already familiar with. I can't remember which, it was like ERS from something like that. And I played the French Disney version of it. And we just looked at, sort of briefly, like, what do you notice in this about like things that aren't translated literally in this in order to make it rhyme, or like sort of catchy phrases that they had decided to do differently. And of course, these were also sort of 601 level students, so they couldn't get everything, but it was like a really great opportunity to just like think about, oh, well, these texts are not just, sort of a static thing, they're like a whole cultural product. So anyway, it got me excited because I just remembered how much fun that was. So I'm so glad to get this part of your class.
Well, I haven't actually, Anna and I have been teaching in the rhetoric department for 2 years now. I am now teaching my own class on the rhetoric of manifestos, where we analyze artistic and political manifestos, which is really exciting. What I do is that, we're often reading manifestos in translation, of course, like especially, like French avant-garde manifestos. And what I do is that I do sort of point to, like I allude to the original text, like especially when there's like concepts that are not as clear in English, I will sort of like refer back to the French, and in that way also like expose them a little bit to the language. But it's like translation plays like a very minimal part in this course. But I will be teaching French 601 next semester. And yeah, I was really interested in hearing you talk about this idea of introducing translation through music. I think that's a very sort of like a very good way of like bringing like translation into the classroom and making them interested not only in the language and the culture. And yeah, I think that's a really good idea.
So it really works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm also teaching language next semester, so these are very helpful.
Yeah.
Doing Spanish. But for now, I guess I'll speak more on the rhetoric side of things. So in rhetoric and writing, of course, we emphasize always the importance of audience, like speaking or writing in a very particular way aimed at a very specific kind of audience. So in that way, and to kind of tie it back to what I was originally saying about rewriting, you can do exercises with your students in terms of like intralingual translation. So one thing that I do that my students have fun with, and we do this in class, is I show them a passage of a novel or something like that deviates a lot from like North American English or Standard American English or whatever it is. And the one that I like to use is Train Spotting by Irvin Welsh. So, which is kind of
Not English. No.
so most of the time they look up at it, they don't even know what it says. And then I'll play them a clip or something like that. And then once they get used to reading it, and it's Edinburgh Scots for those of you who aren't familiar with the text. So then I have them rewrite it for a different kind of audience. So I have them rewrite that same passage for their grandmother or their best friend. And of course, it's the same content, but this is what translation is. It's a type of rewriting. So it kind of, without making the point, but I think since I'm a translator, I'm constantly trying to make the point, even in my rhetoric classrooms, that this is, we're already doing translation all the time, even if we're not doing it interlingually, we're still constantly rephrasing ourselves and posturing in a different way towards a different kind of audience. So that's
I like these stealthy ways of speaking is too strong a word, but like introducing students to some of these same concepts in classes that are even explicitly language classes. It's so interesting. And this series tends to be very focused on pedagogy, so that's why I especially wanted to ask about how y'all are navigating that as graduate students, since I know in many courses you don't have as much flexibility as you would like to shape the content that maybe you would like to. So this is really exciting to hear about how you all work with these topics. So the last question that I had for y'all before we open things up takes a little bit of a left turn, but it's also related to pedagogy in classrooms. And full disclosure, I actually circulated this question ahead of time because I felt like it was kind of difficult. One that's been rattling around in my head for the last couple of months. So what I'd like to ask is that AI is a hot button issue right now in higher education, and perhaps especially in humanities fields. And I've really been noticing a number of parallels between some of the anxieties surrounding how this technology might devalue skills like writing and research, and previous anxieties surrounding tools like Google Translate, having the potential to make language skills obsolete, which obviously, Google Translate's been around for a long time, and we have not explicitly seen that in that way. But I think some of the same fears surround some of these same types of technologies, and so it's been interesting hearing the echoes of that surrounding Google Translate now with AI tools. So I'm curious what your take on the role, what your takes are on the role that these technologies may play in translation studies in the future, whether that's for classrooms or for translators.
I mean, I really need to learn a lot more about AI, I have to say, but I am interested in to see, I mean, for me, translation is such a personal, it requires so much of a person. I'm rather interested to see how AI would do that. It's so much cultural stuff, what you bring to a translation. So I'm interested if AI is even capable of doing that. If it is, it will be quite scary, but I'm kind of, I'm doubting that it will be able to, but who knows, AI. So that for me, it's more of a question right now. Will AI be able to I mean, a translator is so much more than a machine. It's like, it's the whole thing, So I'm interested in how AI will do that job, or if it's even possible. Basically, that's where I'm at. The AI interested.
Yeah, I mean, I find this question, of course, it's fascinating, and also worrying in many ways. But I'm actually kind of hopeful in a way, in the sense that I feel that with the boom of translation studies, I feel like more and more people are starting to think of the translator as a writer. And I think looking at the translated text as, as a text in its own right, that where the translator sort of adds their own, attitudes and their own, perspective. I think a translated text will always be infused with, the subjectivity of the translator. And I highly doubt that AI, I mean, I hope not, that AI would ever reach the point of being able to sort of provide a translation that is as rich and as nuanced as the translation produced by the literary translators. So that's funny.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, but it's
Yeah.
one that I often avoid.
Yeah.
So I would love to
Yeah.
I would love to do more research on what this will look like, but I can only speak to, when I translate, I use so many different tools. I use Google Translate sometimes
Yeah.
to like kind of break open the sentence and see what's happening. I use word reference, I use just the regular dictionary, I talk to native speakers. So I think if we can teach ourselves and maybe our students to just see this as a tool that can actually aid, but it's not like the end all, you still need like the human touch in some way.
Yeah.
And also when I translate, for example, like I've been translating the same Argentine author for years. And her name is Eve Uart, and I look, you know, I don't translate the same word the same way ever. It always varies. But I do need her whole context, everything that I've read of hers, everything that I've translated before, I place it in this very specific way. And so you need to have that sort of knowledge and agility to work with a certain author and a text and their voice. And that's not to mention humor. That's like once someone shows me that AI can handle like with some sort of deft hand humor, then I'll be more convinced. But I haven't really seen that. So when it gets to those complicated levels of nuance, I think, I mean, it would be impressive, but I haven't really seen much of that, but maybe I haven't seen enough too.
Thank you for your input, especially as a practitioner. Your thoughts. Wonderful. So I think we'll go ahead and open the Q&A up to anybody from the audience for either individual panelists or questions for the whole group. Yes.
Hello, do you want me to introduce who I
Yes,
am?
that'd be good.
My name's Acacia Chaidez, and I have been with these wonderful people in conflict before. Thank you so much for your presentations. I loved hearing about your journeys. My question is, I would love for you to reflect on a difficult translation decision that you've had to make, and sort of how you went about it and handled it. Or if it's something that you're still wrestling with, that's totally fine too. And it doesn't have to be like the most difficult, but if you wanted to reflect on that would be great.
I mean, for my project, I don't see it as difficult. I mean, okay, I mean, I was gonna say, I see it as a challenge, but, it doesn't scare me, I just highlight it, I love highlighting, and then just like going back and work on it. I don't let it kind of get me stuck in something, I just keep going, and I translate poetry, so obviously it's quite easy because it's from line to line, and usually whatever I can't understand is in one line, and obviously I just, I go back to my resources. I go back to the internet. I go and ask my advisor, Israel Kava. I'm like, what do you? Sometimes he doesn't know, and it just stays highlighted for months, and then suddenly I'm speaking with someone, or suddenly I'm reading a whole different book, and the same phrase comes up, and I see it in context. Oh, I understand what he meant, and then go back. And obviously, there are some parts that I have yet to still find, because some of the poems of Bojorquez are quite experimental. They're like, sometimes he writes in the manner of, to give an equivalent in English, like Sam Ashbury, is that his name? Ashbury, experimental language poet. So, you know, sometimes things are not supposed to make sense. So it's pretty confusing to know what he really intended to be confusing. When things are experimental, it's hard. So it is a decision I finally have to ask, but it's also, it comes with its own set of challenges. So I'm okay with the complicated stuff. It's just things that I have to work with. And that's one of the reasons why I realized that I couldn't finish the translation. Even though the whole collection only has like 15 poems, I couldn't finish it in one semester because I saw how much work it was. And it's partly due to this specific phrases or words, mostly phrases that I can't quite understand what Bojorquez meant. But that's how I navigate that.
For me, my biggest challenge with this Mexican poet that I work with is the fact that most of his poems are in free verse, but then he has like certain moments where he just like uses rhyme. And like Sims, you know, it's just like specific lines that rhyme. It's really, I mean, like you need to sort of like reflect that in translation. And I mean, like for us who like translate poetry, you know, translating rhyme is extremely difficult. So you just have to find a way to do that. And also, I can't think of a specific example right now, but he's very playful and uses puns sometimes. And that is extremely difficult.
Yeah, in my case, I generally translate prose, but one thing that I've had trouble with are these like Argentine, the Creole expressions that often rhyme and are very playful. Often they deal with animals in some way. So there's one that's coming to mind, and I actually can't remember the original Spanish anymore, but what I had settled on was, I think it had to do with indecisiveness, and it was round and round like a dog lying down, you know, they sort of like go around their own tails and then settle in.
yeah.
And it took me a little while, I mean, UART uses so many of these that I'll spend like a day just considering one, and then I'll think the next thing, oh, that's stupid, or that doesn't work. Often you can sort of bring the image across, which is what I'm aiming for, and the sound. So those are kind of things that I prioritize. And then another difficulty I've had is just with the press that I work with, they don't use footnotes. So, and it's aimed more at a general reader rather than an academic audience. So I really have to make sure everything is there in the text. And I can't be so concerned about things that are lost, like references. Sometimes I can include that in the text. Just add a little bit of the explanation, but oftentimes it doesn't work because I don't want to interrupt that much. And footnotes in themselves are interruptions are kind of like that. It gives me, I have to work with that constraint.
I just want to say, John Ashburn, not Sam.
John Ashburn.
Something I'm reflecting when you're answering so many questions, often in discussions of translation studies, I'm struck by how much translation is like a community or a collective process, whether it's like putting to mentors or peers, speakers of the source language, these are speakers of the language, like other people and the publisher, just that so often translation, if you picture it as just a person looking at a text and writing this down, but it's really often sort of a conversation between many people and consulting others, and how do you do this, or how do you say this, or so it's interesting to hear that coming out of these answers as well already. So, and thank you so much for your question.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Can I ask, just because AI is so huge, and actually I teach third year Japanese, I teach Japanese, and then third year Japanese, it's more like, you know, they kind of got some idea of Japanese, and so I actually let them use to AI, and then AI every time they changes, so they kind of have several of them, and then you know which one is the most appropriate way to so, and that, and also make Spanish, maybe it's, I don't know Spanish much, so different, but the Japanese, we changed all the style of language when you speak macho style or polite style or, you know, the very human-like. And then AI actually does it, like when you're from. So I was wondering, do you actually, as a pedagogy to teach students, do you use AI as a tool? Because I started to use for the third year Japanese. I mean, just to see, and then they actually do quite good showing. I choose, and this one is actually funny and that kind of things. But I was wondering, as a translations, you know, perspective, do you use as a tool in class or?
I have not yet, but I'm all for it. I think it's a fantastic idea. And when I start teaching language, I would love to incorporate it. I think especially when you're all together in class and you can do that sort of discussion and comparison, it makes sense, and you can easily make like a collaborative activity out of this, which is kind of what we're trying to do in class all the time. So thank you for sharing that experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I also haven't used AI, but I think it's a really, really good suggestion, and definitely something to think about.
Something to have in mind. No, I have not either.
Oh,
I'm
not
very
teaching
outside.
translation, but I teach Japanese. So a lot of time, you know,
Yeah.
third year they kind of compares and everything, and we are not collaborating or anything. But then they actually, you have to tell me or tell class to what did you use, and then it's quite interesting how, you know, ChatGPT and the other tools, and you know, the Google now is automatically goes to the AI. I mean, it's gonna be there forever now. So I was wondering.
Yeah, I think one other thing that you've highlighted is that this technology has gotten very sophisticated. Like you were saying, it's able to capture these registers and things like that. So
Some are funny, some
Yeah,
some are
some are
funny,
funny.
but then they're learning so fast because Google Translation when they started, Spanish to English or French to English, its English was so to me that's someone, but then Japanese to English start with so bad, but then within few years they learn so fast.
Yeah.
And they are so fine now, so it's just kind of AI, also. Okay, I just wanted to know.
any questions?
Yes, I want to know how if you have deal with translating written pieces that were actually coming from oral language, for instance, interviews and specifically I asked because while I was doing research for my master's, I had interviews that I collected with migrants in different languages. I had interviews in Portuguese, in French, in Spanish, and then I transcribed the interviews and I had to translate the interviews into English for coding. And first, I was dealing with multiple languages at the same time, right? Which is a challenge in itself, but also because oral language is structured in such a different way than written language that it's really, it was like really hard to make a sentence that actually makes sense. And especially if you're gonna publish in a journal, you have a limited number of pages, you're gonna, I mean, it wouldn't be the best idea to write every interjection, every interruption,
Yeah.
and like every single piece. And even considering that I was working with people whose intention was like not writing these beautiful pieces, was trying to express themselves using a lot of colloquial and language and slangs. And there were so many times I'm like, I'm just gonna translate this. I'm gonna explain it in a footnote. So what would you like, do you have any experience working in this kind of setting, like translating for these purposes, and how do you deal with that?
That's a difficult and a very fascinating project. I guess you would have to figure out, which you've already been doing, or making these choices, like what are you trying to, how are you trying to render this into English? Like, do you want to, if you want to keep the speech patterns, that gives you an additional sort of issue. You're obviously beginning to edit down in a way because you're taking out the interjections and things like that. But then you want the reader in English to understand kind of the way this language is structured. So you have so many different things to consider, and it seems very challenging. I have nothing else.
Yeah. Yeah, I also don't have any experience translating from an oral context, but I can also, yeah, I agree with Anna. It must like that phases itself. That phase, yeah, like you face like specific challenges that are really interesting to think about too. Yeah, thinking about registers, thinking about yeah, and about like this tension as well of like when you're translating also, because there's some theory that talk of translation as clarification, and it's like, but like if like by clarifying, are you straying away from the original text? And yeah, it presents like very interesting challenges for sure.
No, I do. But I think that's one of the difficulties with, like, that's what I was pointing out, a lot of the phrases or a lot of the lines that I find, it's because they're quite oral. And so one of the things, Bojorquez happens to be from Sonora, North America, which is right next to Durango, where my family is from. So I have gone back to my mom and asked her, what do you, and she does know, and she has helped me in my translation in that sense. So I think that it's, I don't know, it speaks to how complicated it is to translate oral. And I am quite interested to see how AI will deal with that, to see if AI will be able to capture this. I mean, you speak Dominican Spanish, I speak Mexican Spanish, and we're constantly asking ourselves to translate each other for each other. What do you mean by that? And then but you always often you come, oh, this is how we say that. This is our equivalent phrase to that. So it kind of at the same time shows me that there is a bit of a possibility, or that is not quite so, why there's always this approach, there's ways of approaching or at least getting close to a translation or as much as possible. But no, I haven't, short story, I haven't done all the translation, except indirectly through the Bohorquez translation.
If I could just interject, only because it's a point that's increasingly contentious among especially ethnographers in that field. Who've maintained a line very similar to Spivak, that translations of oral reporting data are not data. You must code, especially you were mentioning coding them, you must code in the original language. Because anything that you code into a translation is a translated data, so it's different from those that you collected. So it's very much her this very kind of, I'm gonna call it a insistent point that if the translator doesn't know the language and well, then don't translate. And so this would be the case for the ethnographer. If the ethnographer doesn't know the language to be able to code in the language, don't gather data in that language. That's the, if you want to use it for other purposes, and unless political scientists don't seem to be nearly as concerned. But man, the ethnographers are really like, no, you need to know the language well enough to code in the language. Yeah.
We're just reaching the end of
Yeah.
our line, so I want to give a heartfelt thanks to all of our scrutineers. Sharing your expertise
tell you.
and helping us kick off the rest of your.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, and so much for moderating. Thank you.